Hello, my name is Eric Eichhoff, and I have the privilege of serving as the Associate Director of Alumni Relations at John Carroll University. This summer, John Carroll University launched JCU Junior, a program for kids, a brand new initiative aimed at providing engaging, educational, and entertaining programs for families. We are incredibly fortunate to have 5 experts who share their interests and knowledge with us. From space to chemistry and baking to poetry, we hope that this series has something for everyone. Today, we will learn about manatees, the gentle giants of the Caribbean. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to let you know of another part of JCU Junior. The Office of Alumni Relations has created an activity book that families can utilize to help keep kids learning about the topics we are covering. Each JCU Junior session has an activity that coincides with it. By completing a certain number of activities and games, kids can become official JCU Junior graduates and receive a personalized certificate and a special JCU sticker. It is another fun and engaging way to learn from the JCU Junior program. It is now my pleasure to introduce Steve Herbert, Ph.D., John Carroll University's Provost and Academic Vice President. Prior to arriving at John Carroll in 2019, Dr. Herbert earned his bachelor's degree in physics and mathematics from Xavier University, graduating summa cum laude. After receiving his Ph.D. from The Ohio State University in experimental condensed matter physics, he became a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Cincinnati. In 1995, he joined the faculty at Xavier University as an assistant professor of physics, earned tenure in 2001, and was promoted to professor in 2008. While serving as chair of the physics department at Xavier, Dr. Herbert oversaw a comprehensive review of the department curriculum and was instrumental in introducing an interdisciplinary biophysics major. In 2012, Dr. Herbert was appointed the Associate Provost for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Graduate School. Dr. Herbert received the Joan G. McDonald Award for Outstanding Teaching in the Sciences in 2005 and is published in top scientific journals. His research focused primarily on the electrical transport properties of materials. He was a founding member of the Midwest Manatee Research Project, an interdisciplinary group of Xavier faculty and students researching vocalization patterns and behavior of the endangered Florida manatee. So you may be wondering, how is a world-class physicist an expert on manatees? It is a great story, and I know Dr. Herbert will share a bit about this journey. Dr. Herbert lives in University Heights with his wife, Anne. Together, they have 4 sons, 3 grandsons, and a host of family members spread across the country. They enjoy reading, collecting new experiences, relaxing at the beach, and attending musical and theatrical and cultural events. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Herbert.
Thank you, Eric, for that wonderful introduction. Okay, so I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. So we start with what the heck is a physicist doing with manatee research? So I want to tell a story, and along the way, I hope you learn some things. And the story is really about how science is done. And what you'll find in this is that it takes a number of things, and it's not something that just really smart people to do, but it involves people who have curiosity and some resilience, because you get knocked for a loop every once in a while. You have to be stubborn because you can't give it up. But you have to have the ability to observe carefully and ask good questions. That's key. How do you ask good questions? And you have to ask them in a way that you can find answers. That doesn't mean you get all the answers, but you have to ask them so that you can have answers. And then you got to have some basic tools of the trade as a scientist or as someone who's interested in science to know how to answer those questions. And then finally, it takes teamwork. Right? Nobody does science by themselves anymore. The time when you sit in a room and you invent or discover new things is pretty much a myth always. It usually takes a whole team of folks. And so from that perspective, I'd like to share, this is the research page that we put together when I was at Xavier University. And we started our manatee research. We had a group and we have a Facebook page that still exists, even though the research doesn't continue so much. And then I'm going to introduce you to the prime players. And those prime players are Dr. Charles Grossman, he goes by Chuck. So Chuck Grossman, who's a professor of biology at Xavier University. And Chuck's specialty is immunology and endocrinology. It is not zoology or animal husbandry or marine biology, anything to do with manatees. He has to do with disease and disease prevention and the functionings of our endocrine system. And as Eric indicated, I'm a physicist and I explore materials. I explore electrical conductivity, specifically semiconductors and superconductors. And so I have no knowledge about manatees, but that didn't stop us from diving into this because it was an interesting question and a great story. So we got started. And it's something that lasted for more than 15 years, which still astounds me. So I just want to introduce you a little bit to the team. So I'm standing in the middle in the black, and to my left is Dr. Grossman with the glasses on. And you'll see this picture later, and I'll give you some context. And to the right is a guy named Richard Hamilton, who's actually a mathematician and astronomer, and yet we involved him in it. On the right side are the picture of some students at Xavier University that were involved in manatee research. And we were doing this research for some 15 years, and they would come to us to the different zoos and observe the manatees. And so several of these students actually went on to work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife or government agencies, or were still passionately involved with manatees from the early 2000s on. And so all told, we have probably 40 to 50 people, students and professionals that were involved in this project towards the end. So it's important to know that it wasn't just us, it was a whole team, and we brought different expertise as we needed it. So I'd like to start this story with a little bit about manatees. And some of this I've learned over time, and some of this you can easily pick up with research. But this sets the story in some kind of context. So a little bit about manatees. Manatees, the Florida manatee, as we call it, is actually known as the West Indian manatee. And it's one of 4 surviving members of an order of marine mammals called Sirenia. And the other 3 members are the West African manatee, the Amazonian manatee, and a manatee that it's called a dugong. That's over in East Asia. There's another member, a 5th member that's extinct now, the Steller sea cow. It was hunted to extinction a century ago. And Florida manatee actually has 2 subclasses, the Florida manatee and then the Caribbean manatee, as you've seen there. When I grew up, manatees were known as sea cows, and that's what I thought about them until I learned more later. The closest relative of the sea cow is surprising. It's not another marine mammal, it's the elephant. And so the Sirenians belong to a group of mammals called subungulates. The 3 non-marine members are elephants, the rock hyrax, which lives in the Middle East and in Africa, and the aardvark. And they have some shared anatomy with elephants and these other ones, in that manatees have nails, which you can kind of see in this picture here. You see the nails right on the end of their flippers. So they're not very well formed, not quite as much as the elephants, but you can kind of see them. They also have mammary glands under their arms, just as elephants do. And they have prehensile lips, and you can obviously see that with an elephant, but you can kind of see that here with the manatee in this particular picture, so that they can actually move their lips and use them to grab things, especially when they're eating. They'll grab the sea greens and related stuff. And so this is a little close-up picture of the front of the manatee with their prehensile lips. You can see this bony palate, which they use to grab greens, and then they crunch them. They have molars in their mouth. They have rows of molars in their mouth that grow in over time. And this is just another nice picture from one of our manatee researchers. So this shows you where you can find manatees, where their distribution map is. The green is the Florida manatees. It's along the eastern coast of the United States into the Caribbean. And then there's the Antillean or Caribbean manatee, which is in the purple here, down in the Caribbean, and then on the northern part of South America. And then obviously the Amazonian manatee up the Amazon River and its tributaries. And then across the Atlantic Ocean on the west coast of Africa are the West African manatees, appropriately named. And then finally the dugong, which has the largest habitat all in through the Indian Ocean into the Southeast Asia. So that kind of shows you where they are. The West African manatee or Florida manatee is the one that's endangered, even though some of the other ones are being challenged as well. So Florida manatees on the endangered species list. They were added to the endangered species list in the 1970s. And in October 2007, as you see here, the International Union of Conservation of Nature assessed that the West Indian manatee was vulnerable, that they were likely for extinction within the next century or so. And it's because of the great number of manatee deaths for a number of different reasons, and I'll get to that in the next slide. Greatest cause of death for Florida manatees were collisions of watercraft and high perinatal mortality, that is the death of the young, and that's also because of man-made issues, but also other mortality. The loss of warm water habitat. Manatees live in fresh water. They live mostly in the tributaries and estuaries of rivers as they meet the ocean, and the brackish water of the river as it goes into the ocean. They don't tend to live far from the shoreline, so they hug the shoreline where the water is more fresh or slightly salty. And then red tide, which is an infection disease of algae blooms that happened just recently. I think it was last year, 2 years ago in Florida. And it blooms every so often, and it kills lots of Florida wildlife, including manatees. 2007, the actual U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service reclassified manatees, and they took them off the endangered species list, but they moved them to threatened from endangered. And it was just an acknowledgement that the numbers had come up, but it was also, they said that even with this downlisting, as they called it, they took them off the endangered and put them on the threatened list. They said all the protections that we have are going to remain, because even though the numbers are coming up, they're still endangered. They're still at risk in many places. So they kind of made this compromise. They're going to monitor them very closely. And they also added them to other acts, the Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act in 1970 and Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972. So manatees have actually a special status, so much so that every manatee in captivity is owned, if you will, is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They're the ones who determined whether they get to go to a zoo or not. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service shepherds them very carefully. And every manatee you see in a zoo is put there to rehabilitate, and the express purpose is to release them back into the wild as soon as is possible. We can talk a little bit more about that as we go through. This slide just shows a couple of the numbers. You can see over here that the number of manatee deaths per year are ranging from about 500 to 1,000 per year or so. And the populations, when they were counted, are about 5,000. So the number of deaths were quite large, which is part of and this goes back to the 2014 to 2008, more recent numbers. More recently, the populations rebounded, but there's still risks. And then you can see this is just some of the deaths in Florida that they collected some of the bodies. So I don't dwell on that, but this was a real problem. And so I sort of set that up to give you a sense of what manatees are, how they behave, then their status as an endangered species. And that starts the story for how I got involved in this, and then how a biologist and a physicist who knew nothing about manatees got really attracted to this, so that we did our research for more than 15 years on it. It started when Chuck Grossman's family went to Florida for vacation. And his oldest daughter at the time was a senior, going to be a senior in high school, and she needed to do a science fair project. And in their travels and some of the work that they did down there, or the enjoyment, they came across the manatee story. And of course, there were lots of stories of manatees being hit by boats and killed, and manatee death. And she kind of asked her dad, hey, isn't it possible to make kind of a manatee repellent, something that would encourage manatees to stay away from and avoid boats? Part of the problem with manatees is they have no natural predators. They're large animals. They range anywhere from 6 to 8 feet. They go from 3 or 4 feet as babies up to 6 to 8 feet as adults, and they weigh up to 3,000 pounds. So they're quite large, and they have no natural predators. They're also relatively slow moving, and so they just don't move much, and they really have no fear. And so when boats came by, they didn't fear them. And so they would often, they would just not move much, and they're difficult to see in the water, so boats would often hit them. And she said, couldn't we make something, some device or sound or siren or something to scare them away so that we could have a deterrent on boats and reduce these deaths? And so Chuck, when they came back to Cincinnati, he brought this idea and he said, well, I wonder how we do this. And so here's the problem. Can we make a device that would deter manatees from getting near boats and scare them away, so to speak? And can we put these devices on boats? So questions that arise from that basic premise, framing of the question is, okay, what annoys manatees that we might keep them away from boats? Is there something they don't like that would shoo them away, so to speak? And one idea was a siren or some noise or sound that we could project into the water. So we didn't want a chemical. We didn't want something that would pollute the water or endanger things. So sound seemed like a reasonable place to start. And then it begs the question, well, how do manatees hear? What do they hear? How loud are things? What kind of sounds might we put that would annoy them or at least push them away? Can we make such a device? Can we put them on boats? How can we know if this would work? These are the beginnings of framing of the problem. And we didn't have answers to all those, but that was, if I need to answer some of these questions to get at the research. So from there, as scientists, we kicked in and said, all right, how do we approach the problem? The first thing is, how do we get access to manatees? And the easy answer was, we were in Cincinnati. The Cincinnati Zoo had an exhibit called Manatee Springs. It had been there for several years, and we knew they had manatees. So obviously, we could, as scientists, we could contact the Cincinnati Zoo and ask them about that, which we did. And they were willing to cooperate, but they pretty much told us, U.S. Fish and Wildlife has to approve everything you're going to do. And they're on the Endangered Species Act, and you better be prepared. This is a hard question to ask. It's hard to get permission to do anything with manatees because they don't want to put them at risk at all. And so I'll get to these other two questions in a minute, but I can show you the Manatee Springs, show you the Manatee Springs at Cincinnati. This is the exhibit. There are two windows. There's another window over here on the right that you'll see in a different picture. And then this is a picture of one of the manatees in the exhibit, showing them coming up and breathing for air. So we got access to them at the Cincinnati Zoo. It turns out Columbus Zoo also has a manatee exhibit, which we then used a couple of years later. And then there's plenty of exhibits down in Tennessee. There's one. There's a bunch down in Florida. They're spread throughout the country. But we started at Cincinnati. How do we get permission to study them? Well, we had to apply to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we had to ask for permission essentially to do this study. And that process took over a year to get permission. And it started with very basic permission. How do we, so part of our proposal was we're going to drop essentially a speaker into the water and broadcast a tone, a very simple sound that we would like to see how the manatees respond to them. Would this sound annoy them? Would they be attracted to it? How would they respond? And so we needed the equipment to do that. And so the US Navy actually have these things called hydrophones, and I'll fast forward a second and show you the picture. This is a hydrophone that we use, and there's another one that I'll show you in a moment, that could broadcast the sound, and it also could listen to the sound. So it was both a microphone and a speaker. And in order to even just drop that into the tank with the manatees, we had to go through a year's worth of permission from the US Fish and Wildlife Service. So we had to demonstrate that this would in no way endanger or put at risk the manatees. And so they had a whole series of protocols. It was a tough ask. We had to get all the data together. We had to prove that we weren't going to play the sound so loud that it would cause damage to their hearing. We had to demonstrate how we were going to do that. Whole series of questions, and it was really stringent and tough. But finally, after about a year, we got permission to actually drop one of these hydrophones into the tank and just listen. That was it. So that's how we started. And how I got on board is Chuck Grossman came to me and said, look, I don't know a lot about sound. I don't know a lot about sound in the water. And I'm not an expert on electronics. So how do we do this? And so what we literally did is took this hydrophone and went over to the pool at Xavier University in their recreation center and dropped it in the pool. And we put a microphone in and see if we could hear this with the hydrophone. So we were just testing out. While we were doing this, there were people swimming in the pool, and they asked if we were going to electrocute them, and we said, no, it's perfectly safe. So that was kind of fun. So that's how we literally got started, is we just did a test. We just dropped it into the pool at Xavier University and see if we could hear stuff and if we could broadcast stuff. And we were able to do that. So that was fun. And then, months later, 6 months later, we were able to actually get access to the Manatee Springs and start listening to manatees. Now, of course, by this time, Chuck's daughter, who had motivated this problem, had graduated and she had moved on. But we had now permission to do it. So we said, let's just go forward and start the research. It's an interesting question. How do we do it? So how do we get started? Well, here's the hydrophone that we got from the US Navy. We then collected other equipment. This is a sound mixing board, because this hydrophone was sensitive to a bunch of different frequencies that we had to listen to for the manatees. And here's a picture. This is actually one of the first manatees. The previous picture showed you was a later model, but this was one of the first hydrophones that we used. And you can see the manatee in Manatee Springs in Cincinnati swimming past it sort of sideways. And as soon as we dropped it in, the first thing we did the first day, we dropped it in and left it and didn't do anything with it because we didn't have permission to. We were just allowed to drop it in the tank. And the manatees were just curious. So they would gum it and they would mouth it and they would tug on it a little bit. But after a while, they just ignored it. And then over time, we were allowed to actually listen and then broadcast some tones. And so that was our first step. And so you see here, in this picture, this is the back end of the exhibit at Cincinnati Zoo. You can see this pole right here, and then you can see this line coming down. That's the hydrophone that we dropped into the water. And this shows a picture of one of our students sitting there doing some observing, which we got to later. So our general idea was that we were going to broadcast a sound or a series of sounds, kind of like a siren, high, low, and see if it annoyed the manatees enough to move around, to move away from it. And so here's a picture of Chuck Grossman and another gentleman who joined us later, Jeff Johnson, who was a radio engineer who helped us with the sound. You can see here the equipment that grew over the years. We got more sophisticated and we got more equipment that we needed to do the analysis that we needed to do. This is a picture of us up in the Columbus Zoo doing it as well. It happened a couple years later. And so what we did is we said, all right, let's drop the hydrophone in one end, and then we listened at the other of this tank. So this is a graphic of the tank. This is where the two windows are, and there's another window you'll see in a different picture of where the audience was. And then what we did is we observed them and saw if they moved, if we broadcasted from over here, if they moved to this end of the tank, then they would be annoyed by it. And maybe this would show promise for something we could devise that would create a sound that we could make a beacon and shoo them away. And then we would switch, and over on this side, we'd play the sound and move them, see if we could move them back in the other end of the tank. And so what we did is we took, these are the windows, you can see these are the two windows from the observation area, and there's this bubble window on the other side. And we put a grid in front of it. And essentially we mapped where the manatees were, right? So when we started, we mapped where they were, and we mapped how they moved over time as we were playing these tones to see if they would move away. And so we took some data in this, and this is one of the data plots that we had for 4 different hurricanes that we were, 4 different manatees that we were studying at Cincinnati Zoo. And we essentially said the experimental is when we played the sound, and the control is when we didn't play the sound. And you can see that the activity moving from one block to another across the tank that we were trying to get at and analyze, it showed some different behavior. In other words, it looked like it was showing the manatees were moving away from the sound. But in point of fact, when we did this over time, we saw very little effect. In effect, the manatees, they lost interest, they ignored it. We never could play it loud enough that it was like a bullhorn going off. We couldn't do that. We wouldn't do that. It would put them at risk. But the sounds we were playing, they just pretty much ignored. And we tried at different frequencies, at different ranges, in different ways. And over the next couple of years, we determined, yeah, pretty much this isn't going to work. The other thing is, well, what happens if this did work, and how would you put like a siren on a boat and broadcast it under the water? Well, if you had a siren on all the boats down in the Florida water, then you're essentially putting a siren everywhere, and the manatees are just going to be swamped by it and ignore it. So the idea was kind of doomed, but we did some interesting research to get there, both on how they hear and and what else came for that. So the question is, okay, we weren't done, right? This is a frustrating part. And then we got to the point, all right, so now what's next? And then as we were doing this research, looking at their sounds and how they hear, we noticed that the manatees were making these interesting squeaks. And the squeaks had character. They weren't just a straight, flat squeak. They had different tones and different intonations. And so I have a couple of examples here that I'll play for you. The first one's very light and it's hard to hear. So when you hear it, be ready. The other ones are a little louder, you'll hear them. But this first one, you heard that. I'll play it again. It's just a chirp, right? High tone. And this one is actually about 15 seconds long. So you'll hear it. At the end, you'll hear a very loud squeak. I might think back here. So that what you're hearing there is some of the manatees were close to the hydrophone and picked it up loudly, and some of them were far away. And you heard what sounded like might be some call and response. That one manatee would call and the other one would respond back. And so it brought the question of, what are they doing here? Then this is kind of a proto-language. Do they have any meaning or not? And there's this last one, which is a distress call. And you can hear it's very different in tone than the others. I'll play that again. Oops. I'll play it again. Okay, so we were hearing this as we were playing sounds and we were recording some of it and we were asking questions, what are these squeaks? And so we started doing some studies of those. And these aren't like one after the other. We were doing these together at some point as we learned more. So we had some very sophisticated equipment that I showed you in one of those racks. And it was able to take those squeaks over time and split them up into what are called their frequency ranges. And what's important to know here is the shape of this curve in each case is it's called frequency doubled, and they're split into different frequencies. Just like there are different tones and different levels in our voices, manatees have different tones and different levels in their voices. And so could we distinguish each of these manatees by their call, and do each of the calls, the way they're done, have meaning to them? And this is the way we started to get at this question of mapping them out so we can actually see them and begin to analyze. And then what we found is, so these are a couple of different examples of different types of calls. This is one example of what we call a morphology of a squeak, how it started low and went up and then came back down. And we had a couple of other examples. And then we did some very sophisticated measurements of how these are formed. And then we identified up to 14 different forms or morphologies of squeaks. Did they start high, go low, and come high? Did they start low and then rise? Did they start high and go low? Those kind of questions, with an idea of maybe there's some sort of proto-language or at least some meaning to these. And so we were quite excited by this. We actually took a bunch of data, and it was probably some of the best data that people had done. There was a couple other groups that were studying this, but didn't have quite the data we had. But we ran into some other problems again, right? So after a couple of years of studying this and be excited, one of the things we find out is, well, we don't really have a good way of understanding who's making the squeak, right? So I can't identify one manatee. It says, you made this squeak, and then the other manatee responds, because we didn't have a way to distinguish that in the tank. We can never isolate a single manatee in a tank because we never had a single manatee in a tank to study whether they're making sounds on their own, whether they could respond to something or whatever. And then the question is, can we correlate those squeaks, different shapes, with different behaviors? Were they moving away from us? Were they moving from us? Were they moving towards each other? Were they attractive? Were they calling each other? Was a mother calling to a pup? Typically, they don't have live births in zoos. They're usually the young are usually captured because they were orphaned. So there are a bunch of questions we just couldn't get at. And then, look, they're wild animals, and so they didn't always do what we wanted them to do, right? So we got to the point where we really couldn't make a lot of progress without being more invasive, and we couldn't do that with these animals because U.S. Fish and Wildlife were very protective of them, and we would never put them in danger. So in a sense, we got to a point where we couldn't make progress answering the question, is this a language? We couldn't train them. We couldn't devise certain tests for them. It just became too difficult. So that end sort of folded up, but another question arose. And that question was, wait, how do they even make these squeaks? Because we had read not being experts in manatees, although we were becoming more experts at this time, that they don't have vocal cords. And so how do you make sound when you don't have vocal cords? Now, as a physicist, I know you make sounds by things vibrating. You know, you can take a blade of grass and put it in your hands and blow through it, and you can get it to vibrate and it will make a sound. You can take a balloon, you can blow it up, and you can pull on the neck so it gets really tight, and then when the air escapes, the balloon vibrates and makes a squeaking sound. And it turns out that's kind of like how the manatees did it. So what we did is we said, all right, how do we prove this? How do we discover how they make the squeaks and prove it? And so the other thing is they don't breathe underwater. So manatees are mammals. They breathe air, but they close off their nostrils and they keep their mouth closed. So they hold their breath for typically 6 to 15 minutes. Depends on whether they're feeding. It depends on what they're doing. If they're in danger, they'll come up soon. But they tend to lazily rise up to the surface, stick their nose up, open their nostrils, exhale, and then breathe it, and they just sort of float back down. They don't do anything very fast. So they hold their breath for many minutes. And so while they're underwater and making these squeaks, how do they do that when you don't expel air? You know, if you're moving air around and you're not breathing, how does that work? What does the respiratory system look like? Okay, so I have this sort of question, what's up with this? That was the question we have, how are they doing this? So it was an interesting question for us to pursue. And one of the keys came back when we were doing some of our studies on motion, seeing if we could be deterred by sound, and then listening to the squeaks. We happened to be looking at one of the manatees through the window just as they were making a squeak. And we noticed that in this region right here in their forehead, that their forehead bulged out just as they were squeaking, and then it went back. And I have a good picture, oops, wrong way. I have a good picture of this, a diagram that shows that, of before, during the squeak, and then after. And you can see that the forehead is sort of concave, sort of deflated, and then it bulges up as they squeak, and then it goes back. Okay, so that was a good clue. And then we actually spent some time, we put some divers in the tank. There were divers typically, and we asked them to film manatees, and we tried to correlate a squeak on our sound with getting a picture of this happening. So we had document. We managed to get it over time, but it was hard because remember, they're wild animals. They don't cooperate with everything we want them to do, and we did our best. So we were trying to show this. So the next couple pictures show sort of the anatomy of the manatees, and I'm going to focus on this one in particular. You can see the lung right here, and it runs most of the length of their body. And then the air pipe, which goes from the lungs up to the mouth and the nose. There's a mouth right here, the nose comes up here, is connected to the lungs. And then right in between, just like in humans, there's a trachea where the path to the stomach right here and the path to the lungs are in the same place and they diverge. And so we wanted to focus on that. And what we discovered is right up in here, and I'll show a reasonable picture here. There's a cavity, there's the manatee skull. There's a cavity right here in their skull. And right in here, there's a sac, an opening that's basically like a balloon. And what they were doing is they would move air from their lungs up to their trachea into the sac, and it would inflate that, and then it would move back. So they could move air back and forth without breathing. And it was important for us to see that. And so the next thing, well, we said, okay, let's look at the air system. And so this is a casting. This is a latex casting of one of their lung system. This is in the lungs. This is the pathway up to their nose and their mouth. And this is where the trachea is. And this is a blow up of that. You can see that. The pharynx is where we would call our voice box in humans. And this is where we go from the stomach right here to the lungs. This is an actual trachea out of one of the manatees. And what we were able to do is we were able to get one of these manatees, tracheas, and we were able to do some experiments on it. And you see, I'm back to my picture here with Chuck and I with Richard. We were able to take it, we were able to blow air through it and then constrict it. And this is the opening to the windpipe from where the trachea is. And what they would do, we were able to constrict it so that it flattens like when you pull on a balloon and you pull it tight. And what they do is they use muscles on either side to constrict and flatten this opening. So when they force air through it, it vibrates like the mouth of a balloon when you pull the opening tight. And that's how they make squeaks. And we're able then to take it and force air through this trachea and replicate the kind of forms that we saw on the spectrum analysis that we did before, those graphs that I showed you of the sounds. We're able to show that it's a similar sound, and it gave us a reasonable expectation that that was the cause of the sounds of the squeaks. And we were able to put all that together and publish it in this paper in the Online Journal of Biological Services. And it was actually quite a feat for us to do this, because physicists, a biologist, and then we have a whole host of people. As I said, Richard was the astronomer and mathematician. We had a bunch of students, the radio engineer. We had a sort of a technician, a statistician. It was a mathematician, statistician, and a bunch of other folks that contributed to this. So it was a lot of fun. I never would have bet that when Chuck came to me and said, hey, how do you put sound in this hydrophone and record it, that it was going to be 15 years later and be on this journey. So, as I said, back to the story of scientific exploration, you don't need to be an expert at everything. You just have to be curious and know how to ask the right questions, and then involve the right people when you need them. So with that, I'll stop my presentation, and I know Brendan has Eric has some questions for us, so we can go from there.
Well, thank you, Dr. Herbert, again for joining us today. We truly appreciate you sharing your experience in researching manatees, and who knew that, a student's idea of how to protect manatees from boat strikes could lead you on this wonderful journey. Right. It's actually pretty remarkable. As part of the registration process, we had some kids submit some questions. I want to share them with you and get your thoughts about them, if that's okay. The Risinger family asked about how do they defend themselves when they're in danger?
So they have one defense mechanism. It's running away, and what they do is they tend to dive towards deeper waters and dive down. They can only go so far because their lungs are full of air, and they can't get too deep. And they're not deep water animals, but they tend towards deeper water to get away. They're big animals. They weigh up to 3,000 pounds, and they don't move fast. But honestly, they don't have any natural enemies, so they really don't have a lot of defense mechanisms that are effective, because they basically aren't bothered by almost anything. Of course, mankind and boats are the things that bother them the most, but they have no fear of them, and that's been part of the problem.
Great, thank you. We actually had a lot of questions about what they ate, and I know you had some pictures of some of the things that manatees ate. So how much do they eat? That was from Lillian, and she's 6 from Lily Hills, and then Bernadette, who's 4 from Toledo, wonders what they do eat.
Yeah, so manatees are herbivores. They're vegetarians. They eat only sea greens and sea plants. And so what they are fed in the zoos are essentially romaine lettuce, a lot, other types of lettuce for variety. You can see here this one gizmo here. They stick carrots and squash and other vegetables in, so that they can sort of play with them and pull them out and eat them. But they mostly eat salad. And they eat approximately 5 hours a day because they have a lot of mass. They're pretty efficient at digesting their food, but they have to eat quite a bit to sustain it. So I couldn't tell you how many pounds of lettuce they eat per manatee. Partly depends on their size. But I know they eat several times a day, and they spend a long time doing it because they chew it up very well.
Thank you. So Giada, who's 8, was asking, how are they endangered?
They are endangered largely because they have no natural predators, so they don't have an ingrained fear. Their instinct is not to duck and run. It's to essentially stay put. And their biggest enemy is man. And it's mostly the boats. And then the pollution that comes from it, the red tide that often comes from things related. Now, some of that's natural, but some of it's man-made or man-caused. And then just the loss of habitat. So the warming of the oceans isn't helping them, and related things like that. So most of the things that challenged them and put them on an endangered species list were man-made or man-caused, or exacerbated at least.
So humans are having a significant impact on
Significant impact.
their lives.
Yes. And I have to add, they also part of the reason why they're coming back, because once the attention of the global U.S. fish and wildlife community and the conservation community was focused on it, we started to see progress in manatees. And I know there's a much greater awareness in Florida waters in particular about manatees and boats. There's still accidents that happen. Some of them are unavoidable. But I know boat owners are much more cognizant of it, and it's made a difference. It doesn't get them out of the water, but it does make a difference. Just awareness helps a lot.
That's good. It's always good to know that we're actually trying to be good stewards of the environment.
Yep.
So actually one of the questions that I had that kind of came up when you were speaking, I know we often talk about or hear about all the calls that dolphins make. Mm-hmm. And we can hear those to our ears. If a manatee made a call when we were above the tank, would you be able to hear that, or do you need the sound equipment to hear them?
No, you can hear it. Now, they're not as loud as dolphins. Dolphins are more articulate. Obviously, there's more intelligence there to go on. And they do communicate back and forth. And while we suspect it, we don't have the evidence for it yet. You can hear them call when you know what to listen for. If you're standing outside the observation glass, the sound projects pretty well. And so there are times when it's loud enough you can hear that.
Oh, wow.
Often it means manatee exhibits you're far enough away that it's hard to hear it, but if you can get close enough, or if you're standing above the water of the tank, if you happen to be able to do that, you can sometimes hear it. There are times when they're really chatty, and there are times when they're really quiet. So, it's really hit or miss. We find that some days we go and record, they're like, they're just tired or something because they're not very chatty. And other times they just wouldn't shut up. It was kind of fun.
That's pretty neat. So Nico, who's 6, he lived in New York City, asked, are manatees friends with seals?
Nico, I can't answer the question. Generally speaking, seals and manatees don't have much interaction. I mean, obviously they might run into each other by accident. They tend to occupy very different habitats. There are not a lot of seals on the southeast coast of the United States. Seals are omnivores and they're meat eaters, and manatees are herbivores. Manatees are much bigger than seals, generally speaking. And there's not a lot of interaction. They don't have much need to interact. So I'm sure they're not enemies in any way.
And then finally, Evan, who is 11 and he lives in Evanston, Illinois. How do you run a manatee research center in the Midwest? Manatees obviously are not somewhere that we would have in the Midwest. So how do you run it efficiently?
That's a great question, Evan. I kind of outlined how we got started and the why, right? And we were lucky in that we were in a city where we could have access to manatees quickly, Cincinnati, and then Columbus has them as well. And then we discovered the whole network of zoos and aquariums across the nation that have them. And then we discovered how, I wouldn't quite say rare, but how privileged they are, because every zoo or aquarium that you see a manatee, that manatee is on loan. The zoo doesn't own it. They can't say they're going to keep it, and they don't know how long they're going to be there. Manatees will get moved from zoo to zoo based on the resources they have, the needs. Manatees are a large attraction, so zoos like it for their bottom line and for attracting people. And yet the Fish and Wildlife first concern is the well-being of the manatee as a species and well-being of the manatee in particular, that specific one. And so they're always trying to rehabilitate manatees, and then they release them. Some of the manatees we studied years later got released back into the wild. Some of them survived, some of them didn't. And so it was kind of an interesting ecosystem that we got involved when we started the research, to be part of this conservation, sort of worldwide conservation effort. And then we discovered the number of zoos and aquariums that do have manatees, and then what a privilege it is to have them. It was just an insight as a physicist, and I know Chuck as an immunologist, we didn't have, and we came to really appreciate as we went forward. But honestly, how do you do this in the Midwest? You just get lucky. And there's some part of science that always has to involve luck. Hard work, yes, because you don't just happen upon it, but you can work hard and not get all the results and never have this opportunity. And so a little bit of luck is always it's a good thing to have on your side.
I think that's a great lesson. And, again, we thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I remember when I initially read your bio and saw that you were, you did some research on manatees, and I thought how often our kids would love to learn from you. And we appreciate this you helping us with this program. For all the families out there that enjoyed this program, we have the other ones as well. We hope to see you at our other programs. And if you have any questions or would like to learn more about John Carroll University and our alumni relations team, visit jcu.edu/alumni. Thanks and have a wonderful day. Take care.